Elijah Carter wasn't the kind of man who drew attention. He worked from home, kept to himself, and only spoke to his neighbors when absolutely necessary. His house was neat, his yard well kept, and for the most part, people left him alone. That was exactly how he liked it, until one simple decision put him under a microscope. It all started on a quiet Thursday afternoon in Maplewood, Missouri. Elijah had just wrapped up a long morning of work and decided to check something that had been bugging him for weeks: his Wi-Fi speed. Lately, his internet had been acting strange. Video calls were buffering, music streams were lagging, and sometimes pages loaded slower than they should. At first, he chalked it up to his provider being unreliable, but something didn't sit right with him. He decided to dig deeper. Opening up his router settings on his phone, Elijah scanned the list of connected devices, and that's when he saw something he didn't recognize. One device, labeled Maplewood_101, stood out. That was weird. Elijah lived alone. He only had 3 devices connected: his phone, laptop, and smart TV. He wasn't the type to hand out his password. A slow burn of irritation built in his chest. Someone was stealing his internet, and he had a good idea of how. People often set up Wi-Fi extenders to piggyback off a nearby connection, and Elijah suspected that a neighbor had been freeloading off his network. He was done with it. With a few taps, he kicked the unknown device off his Wi-Fi and reset his password. Problem solved. Or at least that's what he thought. He had no idea that a simple reset would turn into something much bigger. While Elijah was standing outside near his driveway, trying to get a stronger signal as he updated his settings, Helen Brooks was watching. From her kitchen window, she saw him standing in the yard, phone in hand, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Helen had never trusted Elijah. Not for any real reason, just a gut feeling. He never attended neighborhood barbecues, never chatted outside with the other homeowners, never even waved when she passed by. And now there he was, standing outside, focused intently on his phone. Something about it felt wrong. Was he hacking something? Was he breaking into a system? Helen had seen enough crime shows to know that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones hiding something. Her heart pounded as paranoia crept into her mind. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious," she whispered, her fingers gripping the receiver tightly. "My neighbor is outside messing with his phone. It just looks off." The dispatcher asked her a few follow-up questions, but Helen didn't have real answers. She just kept repeating, "He's up to something. I just know it." And just like that, the cops were on their way. Elijah had no idea his quiet after about to turn into a full-blown investigation. He thought his biggest problem was a neighbor stealing Wi-Fi. But in reality, something much darker was unfolding. Elijah had just finished updating his Wi-Fi password when he heard the sirens. At first, he barely paid attention. Maybe they were headed somewhere else. But then he saw the squad car slow down and stop right in front of his house. His stomach tightened as 2 officers stepped out. The first was Detective Marcus Tate, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and a steady gaze. His partner, Officer Dana Lewis, was smaller in frame but carried herself with an undeniable authority. Elijah felt a prickle of unease but kept his face neutral. Here we go. He didn't move as the officers approached, but his mind raced. Had something happened in the neighborhood? Was there a crime nearby, or were they here for him? Tate's hand rested near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "Sir," he called out, voice firm but controlled, "we got a call about some suspicious activity. Mind telling us what you're doing?" Elijah frowned, glancing between them, confused by the question. Suspicious activity. He was standing in his own driveway. "I was changing my Wi-Fi password," he said plainly, trying to keep the annoyance out of his voice. Tate exchanged a quick glance with Lewis before looking back at him. "Do you live here?" Tate asked, his voice even but watchful. Elijah almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. His car was in the driveway. His name was on the mailbox. "Yeah," he said, folding his arms. "I've lived here for 3 years." Before Tate could respond, another voice cut through the air. "He's lying." Elijah turned, and there she was. Helen Brooks, standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching everything like she was the neighborhood security guard. She took a step forward, her face full of suspicion. "He's always outside doing something," she continued, her voice sharp. "Always looking around, always messing with his phone. And now he's been standing in the same spot for 10 minutes just tapping away." Elijah couldn't believe it. Was she serious? I was checking my router settings, he said flatly, trying to stay calm because someone I don't know has been using my Wi-Fi. Helen scoffed. Oh, sure. And I'm just supposed to believe that, she said, folding her arms. Tate turned to her. Mom, do you have any evidence that Mr. Carter has done something illegal? Helen hesitated, because of course she didn't. I don't know, she admitted, her voice losing some of its confidence. I just think you should check. Tate exhaled, clearly losing patience. He turned back to Elijah. Sir, would you mind if we take a quick look at your router settings? Just to clear this up. Elijah clenched his jaw. He shouldn't have to prove anything. But he also knew how these situations could spiral out of control. Fine, he muttered, unlocking his phone and pulling up the settings. Here, take a look. Tate leaned in, eyes scanning the list of connected devices. And that's when his expression changed. Because there it was. Maplewood_101. A device that did not belong to Elijah. Tate's posture shifted, his demeanor turning more serious. This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute anymore. Helen, still standing on her porch, suddenly looked uncomfortable. Wait, she said, glancing between them. What do you mean? Elijah turned to her, his eyes cold. He said slowly, someone has been using my Wi-Fi. And if you check the connection logs, you'll see it's been running nonstop. Tate's frown deepened. So you're saying someone has been accessing your network without permission? Elijah nodded. And I don't think they were just stealing internet. He took a breath. I think they were watching. A heavy silence settled over the front yard. Helen, who had been so sure she was in the right, suddenly looked uneasy. Tate straightened up, his voice more serious now. All right, he said. Let's get inside. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with. Elijah didn't argue. He led the officers into his house, frustration simmering beneath his skin. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect in his own home. Helen hesitated before following. She wasn't sure why, but something told her she needed to hear this. Elijah led the officers inside, his frustration barely contained. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, under suspicion in his own home. His living room was clean and simple, just a couch, a coffee table, and a laptop sitting on the dining table where he had been working earlier. Officer Lewis kept her eyes sharp, scanning the room while Detective Tate motioned toward the laptop. Let's see what we're dealing with, Tate said, his voice neutral, but firm. Elijah sat down, pulled up his router settings, and mirrored the screen to his laptop. The list of connected devices appeared, and there it was again, Maplewood_101, still active. Tate's expression darkened as he leaned closer. This device is still connected, Tate asked, his voice growing tense. Elijah nodded, frustration creeping into his voice. It shouldn't be. I changed my password, kicked everything off the network, but somehow it's back. Helen, standing near the doorway, shifted uncomfortably, her certainty now replaced with doubt. Can you tell what kind of device it is? Lewis asked, stepping forward. Elijah clicked a few settings, scanning the device logs, and what he found made his stomach tighten. It's not just a random device, he said slowly, his voice suddenly tense. It's been accessing data, and not just browsing. Tate narrowed his eyes. Be specific. Elijah took a steady breath. It's been accessing camera feeds. A chill spread through the room, the weight of his words sinking in. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Camera feeds, she echoed, her voice shaky. What do you mean? Elijah turned the screen so they could see. Someone has been logging into my security cameras, watching my house, watching me. His hands clenched into fists as he scrolled through the connection logs, and it's been happening for months. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of Elijah's words settling over them. Lewis stepped forward, her tone sharp. You're saying someone has been spying on you? She asked, her expression hardening. Yes, Elijah said, anger creeping into his voice. And it gets worse. His fingers moved quickly as he pulled up more data. This device has been accessing more than just my cameras. He swallowed hard, his voice low. It's been logging into other home security systems in the neighborhood. Helen gasped, her face draining of color. That's not possible, she whispered. Elijah didn't look at her. He opened another log file and the screen flickered to life with a live security feed, but it wasn't his house. It was someone else's living room. The furniture and decorations unmistakably familiar. Helen took an instinctive step back, dread creeping into her expression. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tate's expression hardened as he leaned in. Whose house is that? Elijah clicked another tab, and a new feed appeared, a dimly lit hallway. A bedroom, a backyard. Different homes, different families, all being watched without their knowledge. The reality of the situation hit them all at once. This wasn't just someone stealing internet. This was a full-scale surveillance breach. Helen's face had turned pale. "I don't understand," she said, her voice unsteady. "How is this happening?" Elijah's jaw tightened as he turned toward her. Someone set up a fake network, a Wi-Fi signal that looks like a normal home connection. People unknowingly connect to it thinking it's theirs, and once they do, their devices get compromised, he explained. Lewis's eyes flickered with realization. A man in the middle attacked. Elijah nodded, his voice grim. "Exactly." His tone darkened as he stared at the screen. "Whoever's doing this isn't just hacking into my security system, they're watching the whole neighborhood." Helen staggered back, pressing a hand to her chest, her breathing uneven. "No," she whispered. "That can't be right." Elijah's expression didn't soften. "You sure about that?" With a few more clicks, another feed appeared, this time showing a cozy-looking bedroom, the camera angled toward the bed. Helen let out a choked sound, her eyes widening in horror. "Wait," she whispered. That's Elijah didn't need to ask. He recognized it immediately. It was Helen's house. Helen stumbled into a chair, her hands trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She had been so sure Elijah was the one acting suspicious. But now she was the one being watched. Tate's jaw was clenched, his face unreadable. "All right," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We need to figure out who's behind this, and we need to do it fast." He pulled out his radio and called for cybercrime support, his voice sharp. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered to Lewis. "If someone's running a surveillance network, they're not just invading privacy, they're committing a felony." Lewis nodded, her expression serious. "And if we don't stop them now, who knows how many people have already been compromised?" Elijah wasn't waiting around. He started digging deeper, his hands flying across the keyboard, his focus laser sharp. He wasn't a hacker, but he knew enough about network security to trace where the data was being sent. He opened the IP log, scanning for a location. Then he froze, his stomach sinking. Tate noticed the shift in his expression. "What is it?" he asked, stepping forward. Elijah turned the laptop screen so they could see. His voice was tight, his fingers clenched. "The data isn't going to some random server." He swallowed, his mouth dry. "It's being sent to an address right here in the neighborhood." Helen's eyes widened, her hands tightening into fists. "You mean," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded, his hands gripping the table. "Someone close by is doing this." He worked fast, cross-referencing connection timestamps with signal strength, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. The numbers narrowed, pinpointing the source. Within minutes, he had a match. His stomach dropped, his heart pounding. He recognized the address. Helen's face turned pale as she leaned in to see. Then her breath caught. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's Brandon's house." Brandon Foster, Helen's nephew, a 22-year-old college student who had moved in with her a few months ago. Quiet, always on his computer, rarely socializing. Suddenly, things started making sense. Helen shook her head, her voice weak. "No," she whispered again. "That doesn't make sense. Brandon isn't. He wouldn't." Lewis exchanged a look with Tate, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk to him. Now." Helen hesitated, her body trembling. She didn't want to believe it. But deep down, a part of her already knew the truth. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'll take you to him." Elijah stood up, his hands balled into fists. "I'm coming too." Tate gave him a sharp look. "No, you stay here. Let us handle this." Elijah clenched his jaw, hating the idea of waiting while the truth unfolded, but he also knew pushing back wouldn't help. "Fine," he muttered. "But you better get the truth out of him. Because if Brandon really was behind this, then this wasn't just about stolen Wi-Fi anymore. This was about something much worse." Helen's hands trembled as she led Tate and Lewis down the street to her house. Every step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with the impossible truth. Brandon, her nephew, the quiet young man who barely spoke at family gatherings, was the one behind all of this. She wanted to deny it, but deep down, a small voice in her head whispered otherwise. Elijah watched from his doorway, jaw clenched, as they disappeared into Helen's house. His gut told him this wasn't going to end well. He had been treated like a suspect, accused in front of his own home, only for the real culprit to have been living a few doors down the entire time. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay put for now. Inside Helen's house, the air was thick with tension. She called out, her voice uneven, "Brandon, can you come downstairs for a minute?" No response came from upstairs, just an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Tate exchanged a look with Lewis before stepping forward. "We're going up," he said, voice low but firm. Helen hesitated for a split second before following them, her heart hammering. She hated this. She hated what it meant. She had spent all this time assuming Elijah was dangerous, only to realize she had been living with the real threat under her own roof. They reached Brandon's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, no sounds coming from inside. Tate knocked, his voice sharp. "Brandon Foster, this is the police. We need to talk." For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just as Tate reached for the doorknob, the sound of movement, a chair scraping, hurried footsteps. Lewis's hand instinctively hovered near her holster. "Brandon, open the door," she ordered. "Now." Slowly, the knob turned, and the door creaked open. Brandon Foster stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting between them, like a trapped animal. He was a thin young man, his hoodie slightly wrinkled, his fingers twitching at his sides. His laptop sat open on his desk, screen still glowing. His expression gave him away instantly. Helen swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brandon, tell me this isn't true." Brandon forced a weak laugh, shaking his head. I don't even know what you're talking about," he said, stepping back toward his desk. "What's going on?" Tate wasn't in the mood for games. He stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the small room. "We have reason to believe you've been accessing private security cameras in the neighborhood. You want to explain that?" Brandon's jaw clenched, his fingers curled slightly like he was gripping something invisible. "That's insane," he scoffed. "I don't even know how to do that." Lewis folded her arms, her stare piercing. "Then why is your IP address linked to a network breach involving multiple homes?" she asked. "And why is your Wi-Fi signal being used to send surveillance data?" Brandon's face barely flinched, but his fingers twitched. His gaze darted to his laptop for the briefest second, and they all noticed it. Tate's patience snapped. "Step away from the computer," he ordered, voice firm. Brandon hesitated. Then he lunged for the keyboard. Before he could hit a single key, Tate was on him. He grabbed Brandon by the hoodie, yanking him backward. The younger man struggled, thrashing wildly, but Lewis was faster. She had her cuffs out in an instant. Click. It was over. Brandon Foster was under arrest. Brandon sat on the couch, wrist cuffed in front of him, his head hanging low. Helen stood across from him, arms wrapped around herself, tears brimming in her eyes. "Brandon," she choked out. "Please tell me you didn't do this." For a long time, he said nothing. Then he let out a long, shaky exhale. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered, staring at his hands. "It started as a joke." Tate frowned. "A joke?" he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You hacked into people's security cameras for fun?" Brandon ran a hand through his messy hair, his shoulders slumping. "I was just messing around," he mumbled. "At first, I just wanted to see if I could get into someone's Wi-Fi, like a challenge, you know. Then I saw that I could access their cameras." And his voice faded. Helen covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head. "And what?" Lewis pressed. "You just kept watching. Didn't care about what you were invading." Brandon looked at the floor, his face burning with shame. "I didn't think anyone would notice," he admitted. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I got addicted to it." Tate's expression was unreadable, but his voice was cold. "That's not an excuse." Helen sobbed softly, turning away from her nephew. She had trusted him. She had taken him in. And this was what he had done. Elijah had been right all along. The next day, the news broke. Local man arrested for hacking into neighbors' security cameras. Cybercrime in the suburbs, how one neighborhood was secretly watched for months. Helen barely left her house. She couldn't face the neighbors, couldn't handle the whispers and stares. She had spent so much time fearing the wrong person, and now she had to live with the shame of what had been right in front of her all along. Elijah, meanwhile, kept to himself just like always. But now when he walked outside, people saw him differently. The man they once mistrusted was the reason their privacy had been protected. The irony wasn't lost on him. One evening, Helen finally worked up the courage to knock on Elijah's door. He opened it, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Elijah," she said softly, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry." He studied her for a long moment. Then he exhaled and shook his head. "I don't need an apology," he said. "Just do better." Helen nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will." She meant it. Brandon's arrest served as a wake-up call. It wasn't just about hacking, it was about assumptions. Helen had been so sure Elijah was suspicious, so certain he was the problem, that she failed to see the truth. The real danger wasn't the quiet neighbor who kept to himself. It was the one she trusted. People judge too quickly, jump to conclusions without facts. But this story proved one thing: when we assume the worst about someone without proof, we risk protecting the real threat. Elijah had never been the enemy. But it took a scandal, an arrest, and a hard lesson for people to finally see it. And next time, maybe they wouldn't be so blind. We live in a world where people jump to conclusions faster than they seek the truth. Helen was so sure Elijah was the problem, she judged him not by his actions, but by his silence. And yet, the real danger was the person she trusted, the one closest to her all along. This story is more than just a case of cybercrime, it's a wake-up call for all of us. How many times have we misjudged someone based on assumptions? How often do we let fear, prejudice, or rumors cloud our thinking while the real problem goes unnoticed? The greatest mistakes we make aren't always about what we don't know, but what we're so sure of, yet completely wrong about. Before you label someone suspicious, before you believe the first thought that crosses your mind, stop and ask yourself, do I really know the truth? Because the worst thing we can do isn't just being wrong. It's being so convinced we're right that we ignore reality. Let this be a lesson. Pay attention. Ask questions. Seek the truth. Because sometimes the real threat in the person standing in the shadows is the one hiding in plain sight.